Good afternoon, everyone, and I am so excited to welcome you to our second round of Policy for the People series, Voting Rights in Black America. This session is being presented to you by the Executive Leadership Council and also by Union Pacific Railroad and Lyft. Before we begin our session, I'd like to introduce a staple in the voting rights movement. I'd like to introduce Congressman Mark Vesey. Congressman Mark Vesey is an advocate for Texas's middle-class families and committed to creating jobs, improving public education, fighting for immigration reform, and ensuring access to quality healthcare and women's reproductive rights. Congressman Vesey was appointed in the 116th Congress to serve on the Committee on Energy and Commerce. Prior to his new committee appointments, Representative Vesey served on the Armed Services Committee and the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Throughout his time in Congress, Representative Vesey founded the first Congressional Voting Rights Caucus to address the immediate need to eliminate barriers and discrimination too many Americans face at the polls. In the 114th Congress, he accepted his appointment as the Assistant and Regional Whip. In the 116th Congress, the congressman was appointed to serve as whip for the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force. Representative Vesey is currently a member of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, Congressional Black Caucus, and the New Democrat Coalition. He also co-launched the Blue Collar Caucus with Congressman Brendan Boyle to find solutions to problems too many middle-class Americans are facing. Please welcome Congressman Mark Vesey.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be with everybody today to really talk about something that's obviously very timely, and that's voting and the impact that voting is going to have on our future in the next 4 years, and possibly even longer as we think about the Supreme Court justice that's about to be appointed and how long they're going to make decisions based on the area of voting rights and how it's going to be felt for generations to come. Again, I'm Mark Vesey. I represent the 33rd Congressional District in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. For those of you watching the World Series, you see the stadium there. That's in my district in Arlington. And I want to extend a very special thanks to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for really inviting me to talk about this very critical topic as we head into the last 2 weeks of the 2020 campaign. In 2016, as was already mentioned, I founded the Voting Rights Caucus with my colleagues Terry Sewell of Alabama and Bobby Scott, who represents Virginia. The caucus was really intended to address a lot of the immediate concerns and some of the barriers that we see communities starting to have to face again since the Voting Rights Act was passed in the 1960s. You're starting to see a lot of regression in these areas. And that's one of the reasons why we formed this Voting Rights Caucus. And really now the work, and you probably saw the remarks last night from Director Ray, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We know that now this work is more important than ever amid the 2020 election, where we have seen unprecedented efforts to silence our voices all across America. And everything from attempts by the Trump administration to curb mail-in voting during a pandemic and by gutting the U.S. Postal Service, Republicans are really trying to make it very hard for people around the country to exercise their right to vote. A perfect example of that is in my own home state of Texas, where in Harris County, which is one of the largest counties in the country, definitely the largest in Texas, they have over 4 million voters, and they reduced the number of drop-off boxes to 1 for the entire county. There have been reports about people waiting in my district and other places across Texas 4 or 5 hours just to cast their right to vote. And to me, it's very evident that voter suppression has taken place right before our eyes in our country. And that's why the work the Voting Rights Caucus is doing is so important to make sure that we have fair elections across all government, all forms of government, be it local, county, state, and again, federal. And really now, I think during the pandemic, we have to also be mindful that there are people that could be afraid of voting. I witnessed just a couple of days ago a woman voting in my district, African-American woman that was able to use curbside voting because she couldn't get out of the car. And of course, they've canceled that now in Alabama. It's just things like that that I think are scary. We put some money into the HEROES Act and CARES Act. We're able to get CARES Act, but not HEROES, to try to address some of these upcoming problems that could really wreak havoc on the 2020 election. But unfortunately, again, as I mentioned, now we only have a couple of weeks left until the election day. We just have to hope that there's no damage that's been done by the lack of action in the Senate and in the president's office on this very crucial and critical area. And so, I just want to, again, thank the foundation for putting this together. I sponsored a resolution last month that dedicated September as National Voting Rights Month. And we're going to need more issues like that. We're going to need more legislation like that to really galvanize around and rally around so people really understand what's at stake here, not just in the 2020 election, but in elections in the future as it pertains to our right to vote and the ease that we should be able to vote for. And that's what we fought for, to make sure that we can still continue to have our voices heard during these elections. So thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to you now.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I think just from what you're saying and what we're going to learn from the rest of this panel, like the Voting Rights Caucus and other organizations that are dedicated to protecting our vote are going to be so important. And now I will introduce Ms. Crystal Ashby, who is representing the Executive Leadership Council. Ms. Crystal Ashby is the interim president and CEO of the Executive Leadership Council, the preeminent organization for Black CEOs, board of directors, and the most senior Black executives at Fortune 1000 and Global 500 and equivalent companies. She leads the organization's efforts to increase the number of global Black executives in C-suites, on corporate boards, and in global enterprises. She is the first woman president and CEO of the organization and traces her association with the ELC to her participation in the first class of the ELC's Strengthening the Pipeline Leadership Development Program. Ms. Ashby is an accomplished senior executive, board member, and lawyer with more than 34 years of leadership experience and success, significantly in the energy sector. Her corporate leadership experience was gained over a 22-year career with BP, where her role spans government and external affairs, law, compliance and ethics, university relations, and retail. Effective January 2020, Ms. Ashby is an independent director on the board of Texas Reliability Entity. She is an NACD fellow and member of the International Women's Forum and has served as the director on several boards of organizations. Most recently, she was the vice chair of the ELC. She serves on the University of Michigan Engineering Dean's List Leadership Advisory Board. She served on the National Board of Genesis Works and the Holocaust Museum Houston Board. Crystal earned her Juris Doctorate from DePaul College of Law and holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree with a double major in English and psychology from the University of Michigan. Please welcome Ms. Ashby.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And what we learned there is that we need a much shorter bio. So forgive all of that. But good afternoon and welcome to everyone joining us today. It's such a pleasure to be here. The Executive Leadership Council is honored to serve as a partner on today's important voter issue forum hosted by the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. At the ELC, we are working to ensure every eligible voter is ready and registered to exercise their voice, their vote, and their power in the November elections. We know everyone can play a big role in driving our organization's shared goal, as our collective impact and power will be incredibly important for our community, the Black community, in the upcoming elections. Our nation is at a critical moment, and everyone must know the leaders we elect in November, because they will make decisions that will affect our lives forever. You have the power to impact the direction of this country by voting. One of the ELC's most valuable investments this year has been supporting organizations and efforts committed to registering people to vote, specifically our people. As Congressman Vesey said, they need to be able to vote, and they need to be able to vote safely. Our people, the Black community, because our voice is critical in shaping the futures for our communities. We look forward to continuing our partnership with CBCF to ensure everyone is registered and educated on all the issues affecting our community. Today's lineup is the epitome of Black excellence in action. We are fortunate to have the nation's leading experts on Black voting rights issues share their valuable insights at this incredibly critical time for our community. I know many of them personally, and you are in for some very, very good information. Thank you for your time, and thank you for being here. And thank you, CBCF, for leading this important effort. And what I know is I stand between you and the information that you need. So I'm going to step aside and let us get into some good trouble.
Thank you so much. And like you said, we are about to have a very dynamic panel with a very intelligent group of people. And next, I will introduce Mr. Terry Atkinson from Union Pacific Railroad. Mr. Atkinson currently serves as the Assistant Vice President of Marketing and Sales Industrial Products, where he leads a dedicated team of marketing and sales professionals within the construction, forest products, and metals commodity teams. Terry joined Union Pacific in 2004 as a marketing and sales intern and has held various full-time roles within the department in both Omaha, Nebraska, and Fort Worth, Texas. During his career at Union Pacific, he has spent his time leading teams, recruiting new professionals, negotiating contracts, and helping customers develop new rail terminals throughout the US. Terry is a member and past vice president of Union Pacific's Black Employee Network, as well as a founding board member of the UP Ties Young Professionals organization in 2008. Terry received a Marketing and Sales Summit Award in 2013 for his efforts, a part of the team that redesigned the customer satisfaction process, and was a 2015 participant in the Marketing and Sales Operations Shadow Program. In 2019, he successfully completed the Union Pacific Leadership Development Program and was also recognized by Progressive Railroading as a rising star in the rail industry. His passion for being an inspirational leader and promoter of his team members has gained him the title of mentor to many of his former employees and team members. Terry is a native of Louisville, Kentucky, and graduated with a Bachelor's of Business and Finance from the University of Kentucky and a Master's of Business Administration with an emphasis in logistics and transportation from the University of Tennessee. When he isn't working, Terry spends his time being an active father to his daughter, son, and goddaughters, and a devout husband to his wife, Diana. Please welcome Mr. Atkinson.
Thank you, Naomi. Welcome to the panelists and each of you who have taken the time to join this session regarding voting rights in Black America. We at Union Pacific have been partnering with CBCF since 2008 and are thrilled to be sponsors of today's session because of the topic is so critical to our nation and our company. Over 40 years ago this month, Congress passed the Staggers Rail Act, which opened up our industry and gave railroads an opportunity to thrive to a point where we are today, helping deliver some of the most important goods across America, from building materials to grain, finished autos, and consumer products. Because people took the time to exercise their vote, we have this piece of bipartisan legislation, and I, for one, am glad that we do. Again, welcome to today's virtual session, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Terry. Now I am so excited to introduce our moderator for today's session, and I know she will hold it down for us and allow our participants to get the most out of their presentations. Please welcome Ms. Michelle Jawando. Michelle Jawando is an attorney, public policy expert, social justice advocate, familypreneur, and Afrotech futurist with a lifelong dedication to public service. She currently serves as the head of U.S. Strategic Engagement and Public Policy Partnerships at Google. As a member of the public policy team, she is responsible for developing strategic relationships and partnerships with nonprofits, think tanks, elected and thought leaders across the U.S. Prior to joining Google, she served as vice president for the Center for American Progress, a progressive think tank where she also served as a co-host for a nationally recognized political news podcast, Thinking Cap, a co-host on SiriusXM and a news cable network contributor. Before that, she served as general counsel and senior advisor to United States Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. Ms. Jawando was responsible for leading some of the office's landmark work, including the passage of the 9/11 health bill and repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, and the confirmations of Supreme Court Justices Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan. Michelle has been a guest speaker for numerous panels and national conferences. We are so excited to have her host our session today. Please welcome Ms. Michelle Jawando.
Hey, everybody. And let's give Naomi a round of applause for reading all of our bios. If you were joining us, you could just wave in the air. Naomi, I will tell you, one of the things that really set me on my professional career was serving as a law fellow with the CBC at the time, then Congressman Greg Meek. Shout out to all the New Yorkers dialing in. And so it is great to just continue to see the great legacy of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. That does not happen without partners like Union Pacific and ELC. So thank you for all you do, Naomi, and thank you for everyone at the CBC and in the CBC and at the foundation. So I want to get right into it because I am so happy to be joined by one of my dear friends, Spencer Overton. We're not friends yet, but we will be, Marissa McBride and Crystal Ashby, by the time this panel is over. And when I think about my career, I started, and I tell people, I started as a baby lawyer after Bush v. Gore. And coming out of that moment, that was really an inception point here in the country. And having your first experience as a young lawyer, really looking at how do we think about who has value and connecting that to the vote. And that was just such a clear moment in history where we really saw this tension between what people chose and what our systems then put in place. Our panelists this afternoon include Spencer Overton, who is the president of the Joint Center, Marissa McBride, who is the director and board member of the Voter Participation Project. And I'm so happy I saw my sister Amanda Jackson just jump in there from Color of Change, who is the campaign director of Media, Culture, and Economic Justice at Color of Change. So I want to kick this off, Spencer, with you. We have been in the trenches. In addition to leading the Joint Center, Spencer is a law professor. He's the author of Stealing Democracy, which is really a foundational text. So I'm going to ask all of you to put it on your Amazon book list. Okay, come on, Spencer, come on with the ad lib. There you go. And just kick off for you, really what set you on the course to really look at this work, and how has it been foundational, the work of voting rights in your life?
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. And, obviously I got to say thanks for the CBCF for being a great partner in advancing diversity on the Hill. You all have been great partners there. Amanda and Marissa, great to be on the panel with you. ELC has played a big role in expanding economic opportunity, and we need both an outside and an inside game in terms of what we're doing in both the public sector and a private sector strategy, and you all have been key. And I'm sorry, but I got to say, Michelle, Google has been a great supporter of the Joint Center's work on the future of work in Black communities. As you know, Chanel Hardy is on my board. And Michelle, with regard to you, I can't speak highly enough of someone who is both intellectually accomplished as a Hampton University graduate, while also seeking spiritual humility and wisdom as a member of Kingdom Fellowship AME Church. So I'm just in awe here in terms of being in your presence here. So we've got some things going on right now, Michelle, that I want to tee up here. And they're related to what is happening in our country. The Williams and Calvin Facebook page, it started operating as early as January 2016. They purported to be two Black folks, two Black men from Atlanta. They started out doing posts on police violence, incarceration, disparate treatment in the news media, and they got a significant following. This is 2016, right, Michelle? And then on election day, 2016, they ran this ad here, and they targeted Black folks in terms of micro-targeting here. And the ad said, you know, we don't have any other choice but to boycott the election. No one represents Black people. Don't go to vote, right? And after the election, it turned out that this ad and many others was run by the Russians here. Their Williams and Calvin Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube accounts. They were fake accounts that were set up by the Russian Internet Research Agency. As I said, the Russians erected many other accounts to different groups, but Black folks, it was unique because they encouraged them to not vote. Black folks to not vote, encouraged us to not vote. Even though we're only 13% of the population, the Russians directed 38% of their US Facebook ads toward African Americans, and these ads resulted in 50% of the user clicks. And you know this well, 96% of their YouTube accounts and content were focused on Black folks in terms of the Russians, right? So this has been an issue. Also, the Trump campaign divided millions of Americans into several categories, including a category called deterrence. They micro-targeted deterrence voters with tailored social media to discourage folks from voting. African Americans were targeted. For example, even though Black folks are only 22% of North Carolina's population, they were 46% of the North Carolina voters labeled deterrence. 3.5 million Black folks were targeted for deterrence. We know that 2016 marked the most significant decline in Black voter turnout in modern history. These efforts seem to be continuing in 2020 during the Democratic presidential primary. The Russians targeted Black users with online disinformation. This was on Senator Kamala Harris here. This is from the Russians. Also, in March of 2020, Facebook and Twitter acknowledged they removed a network of Russian-backed accounts originating in Ghana and Nigeria that targeted Black communities in the US. This ad is from Ghana. So we're facing some unique challenges. I want to get a little bit later in our discussion into some of the unique challenges that we're facing in terms of vote by mail and in terms of registration and other things. But I just wanted to tee us up by focusing on these new challenges that we're facing. And I'm sorry, I got to say this. Right now, we've got some folks who are saying companies shouldn't be able to take down harmful, discriminatory content online, and that is a problem. They're trying to manipulate Section 230 and frankly bully companies into not taking down this disinformation that suppresses Black votes. And it's something that, you know, we've got to stand up to and be very vocal about. So let me just stop there. We'll talk more about some of these other topics. Just wanted to tee it off with that.
No, I think that's great, Spencer. And, you know, listen, we are a visual people. And so the fact that you are able to kind of put pen to paper and give us some clear examples, I think one of the things that we recognize is that those who seek to suppress the vote of Black people are vigilant. And that same level of vigilance is required for how we combat that and how we really think about access and opportunity. So with that, I want to turn and bring into this conversation, bring into this space, Marissa McBride, if her dog will let her, in the background there, but kind of bring you into this conversation and hear some of the work that you're really focused on over the next 12 days and some of the work that you've been doing over the year.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to the CBC Foundation for having us. You know, I think you're exactly right when you talk about vote by mail, voter registration, and the onerous attempts to ensure that Black people don't vote. These are not new things, and they are quite vigilant when they're targeting our community. So we started really, since 2016, we've been running ongoing voter registration and vote by mail request forms and trying to make it easier or as easy as possible, particularly in states where they make it as difficult as possible to get people registered, re-registered, and request a vote by mail ballot. We sent over 300 million pieces of mail. We also ran pretty wide-scale digital programs, but our work is going beyond where campaigns typically focus in terms of like the 30 to 70 in terms of vote propensity. We want to go down to 0. We want to talk to people that no one else is talking to. We want to go into communities and really use a geographic approach to, one, educate people about what's going on around them, the attempts to ensure that they do not vote, and then also make it easy. We just don't make it easy in this country to do anything around voting. I mean, the rules of the road change cycle in and cycle out. Understanding where, you know, your voter registration doesn't follow you when you move county to county, city to city, or state to state. So basically arming our community with, one, the information that they need to know what's going on around them, making it easy by taking the first step for them and bringing democracy to them by sending them a voter registration application, you know, pushing them online to the Secretary of State site or giving them a vote by mail recruitment tool so that they can then register themselves, but really create a surround sound in terms of engagement. And I think one of the things that's happening right now, people are picking their heads up and realizing we're not doing so great in Wisconsin in terms of, you know, young Black men and young Black voters, generally speaking, but we're 12 days out. Like, this work needed to really start 15 months ago, 18 months ago. It can't be episodic. It has to be consistent and it has to be persistent. And that's really the work that we're doing to make sure we're bringing as many people into the process and keeping them in the process, cycle in and cycle out.
Now, Amanda, I saw you nodding your head vigorously. Tell us a little bit now. Now, I will say my brother Rashad and the amazing team and Sabrina and so many others at Color of Change are really a part of this vanguard, really making these intersections between disinformation, kind of traditional voter suppression, and also tying this to economic outcomes, right? Because we know if we can not have you turn in your census vote, then there's less resources going. If we know that we can isolate you on certain areas, then that's less of communities that we have to be accountable to. Tell me a little bit about how you are approaching some of the work you've been doing and really how you got into this work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. And also thank you to the CBC Foundation. Hi, Marissa and Spencer. I've been following you guys' work for quite some time. You know, it's interesting you mentioned the census because I just sort of think about the fact that, you know, we're 10 years beyond the 2010 census, and we're still reeling with the impact of what that has meant, right? We see how the Republicans and the GOP at large have leveraged the census in a way that have put our communities on defense. And we find ourselves just sort of responding and trying to grapple with the outcomes of that. And then of course, the premature court ruling that happened just last week. And so I sort of think about that because that for me entails and encapsulates all that's at stake and what that does, the disservice and disinvestment that does to our communities. And so with that in mind, right, like that being the backdrop for us and our response, we at Color of Change, along with Sabrina, Rashad, and other folks, just dedicated campaigners have put together if I could boil it down, it feels like we're doing a lot, but if I could boil it down to just sort of 2 buckets of work, we have put together a voting response or democracy response situated in targeting corporations and getting them to give their folks paid time off to vote, right? Like we understand the circumstances in which folks unfortunately have to continue to vote. And so given that, flexibility is required. And so we very much so want corporations to lead with that in mind. And from that, we're targeting, Amazon, Walmart, United Healthcare, Home Depot, just a number of corporations who in some way have expressed a commitment around wanting to support democracy, but have not actualized that, and trying to get at least those identified targets to move beyond the statement of how they talk about voting, actualize that for our communities. And then of course, the piece around misinformation, information, disinformation, and then how all of that effectively feeds voter depression for Black communities, right? Like thinking about your presentation, Spencer, and all the bots and the clicks, and how that has just sort of led to an unfortunate, but very real apathetic view of what it means to show up in this moment. And so like, how are we combating that with our communities and relying on our list to do that? Our squads, as we call them, throughout the country, putting together the content to respond and having forums like this to try and pull back folks from, this, what is democracy or democracy doesn't serve me ledge, and try and round out how all of that is in fact both mis and disinformation.
That's right. And for those who are listening in or following us along on Facebook, I'll just ask, make sure you send us questions. We're going to do a robust Q&A so that we can kind of bring your voices and your questions and your concerns. Spencer, so part of the genius on this panel is that they put 2 Hamptonians. So I just got to get out there. There was a sister in the chat who represented as well. I can't help myself. And all of the folks who are joining, I have my AKA colors on because there just happens to be an AKA on the ballot in 12 days. I just can't help myself. I had to throw that in there. So Spencer, one of the things that I continually hear, and I think all of us in our own way have spent a lot of our professional careers really helping to demystify voting, right? You hear these kind of get out the vote, you have a right, you have to vote. But as I think Marissa so eloquently shared, just the process of voting, depending on where you live, can be so arduous. We see these images of 3 and 4 hour lines help break down some of the challenges throughout the process and help us to kind of demystify what those challenges signify and some of the things that you encourage for people to think about as they make their plan to vote over the next 12 days.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I think the number one thing is it's important to vote and important to make a plan to vote. So we're identifying some of these challenges, and the objective is not to discourage anybody. It's to say they're out there. We're going to deal with them. We're going to address them. So it's important to get out and vote, make your plan to vote. So I want to acknowledge some of these special challenges in this particular environment here. This right here is one of them in a COVID world. The fact that registration before the virus, Black voters reported being registered through voter registration drives at twice the rate of white voters, and at public assistance agencies at almost 5 times the rate of white voters. The pandemic has reduced these registration opportunities. So, this is a significant issue. Here's another issue in terms of vote by mail. Now, the president has talked about fraud, and this has been really just frankly a non-issue. A study has shown that 1 out of 39,000 vote by mail ballots have challenges. You are 13 times more likely to get struck by lightning at some point in your life than commit voter fraud. That's not the issue. The issue that we find is that there is a rejection of votes by the registrar. it's more likely. So in other words, if you have an undervote or an overvote or some problem, if you're at the polling place, it's more likely that a machine or somebody will say, hey, you need to correct this. That safety net is not always there in terms of vote by mail. If you happen to have had a stroke, and so your signature is a little different, your ballot might get rejected here in terms of signature match. So this shows that just in Georgia, for example, Black voters were 3 times more likely to have their vote by mail ballots rejected. And it's only, 2% versus 0.6%. But if you multiply that times thousands of ballots, it could be an issue here. Another big issue is wait times, right? So in the last election before COVID, Black folks waited on average 60% longer than white folks here. So the question is, in this new COVID world, what will the reality be? We saw a taste of the reality in 2012 in Milwaukee, where only 5 of 180 polling places were open. And the precincts with the highest percentages of Black residents dropped from 37% down to 18% here. And so, we don't want to see that in the general because of the barriers. The goal here is we're doing this is, you see in 2016, kind of how people voted. And if we can double basically the percentage of people who vote by mail and who engage in early vote, you can get your election that day turnout down to 20% of the total electorate, which could hopefully reduce lines and make things safer here. So this is kind of the direction that one would go in. But again, we do want to be very careful with this vote by mail and absentee because of the huge error rate. So folks, and I've already done this, I'll make a mistake in a minute if I'm like watching TV and trying to multitask, right? Like, so when you're filling out your vote by mail, sit down, focus on it, fill it out, don't do anything else. There's that piece. And then the other piece we got to flag, and I raise this with Amanda here, just because I think color of change is so important in terms of our democracy and pushing folks in the right direction. We got the situation with the Supreme Court, and a question here is, even if there is some win and we're able to realize, renewal of the Voting Rights Act and, all these voting changes, will things be struck down by a Supreme Court? They're basically saying that folks in Alabama can't have drive-through voting so that people who are elderly and who are disabled can vote without risk of COVID. You got a court that's basically saying, hey, at the last minute, a state that used to be covered by the Voting Rights Act in terms of pre-clearance, Texas, can change their rules at the last minute so they have only one box per county, one drop box per county. And so a county like Harris County, where Houston is, that has millions of voters, has one drop box, and a rural county that has 5,000 people has one drop box. That's just illogical. And it's, I just think that this court issue is a big issue. And I just think that the color change and other folks who are about movement building, play a critical role in terms of keeping our eyes on the prize and protecting voting rights.
That's exactly right, and so well said. And so, kind of on that point, as we really think about accountability, Amanda, I'm going to turn to you because I think that there is such a sense. Listen, I did one of these panels last night, and one of the prevailing concerns is this sense of anxiety that so many of our people feel. I think, if we are honest, many of us are not doing well when we think about the dual challenges of just constant the way that racism shows up in our lives in big and small ways. So many of us, you are 4 times as likely as a Black person to know someone who's either had COVID or who has died from COVID, myself included. And so when you think about these challenges, at the same time trying to show up and go and vote, there's this sense of overwhelmingness about the moment. And so I'd love to hear from you how you're both on one hand, asking for accountability, but also how you're inspiring people in the midst of these challenges.
Yeah, I actually, it's a great question. You know, I think more microly for myself, I will say that I remind myself that more is at stake than, me, right? Like me and those within 6 degrees of separation from me. And in that way, I scale just sort of my personal response and feel it more of a responsibility. And I recognize that, that's just an approach for myself, that is not something that, would work for others, right? It's not an approach that we can expect to, an emotional response we can expect to scale across communities. But I think what could be is drawing more so an affirmative vision of how we could vote, right? Like Sabrina and I are working on actually a project that puts together a best case scenario of how we could vote, right? Like we can deposit checks from our phones. What does it look like perhaps to lean into technology in that way and illustrate a world that does not suppress the vote, that believes in actually not only one's ability and access to vote, but the dignity behind that vote. And so through this storytelling project, we're hoping that folks open themselves up to a world where voting isn't tedious, it isn't targeted, it isn't discriminatory, and let that carry within our communities. And then more macroly, for us, we're going to hold the systems at play, accountable. We're going to respond to their charges. Your point, Spencer, around the Supreme Court is exactly right? Like that is another plank for us to lean into and do some movement building, galvanize some energy around. So we're looking at that as well. Because even I would even take your point and scale it, right? The Voting Rights Act, what do we think they'll do to the Civil Rights Act? Right? Like all of the acts that protect who we are, protect our communities. And so for us, it's a matter of leaning into those precedents that have at least affirmed our visible presence, but then, calling on the folks who have been through with us, who follow us, who are, fans or members, as we often say, leaning on them to help carry the message forward. So I think there are 2 things for us after leading up to November 3rd and after, and hopefully the bigger piece of that is leaning into an affirmative vision of what it could mean for us to vote in this country.
And I'm sorry, Michelle, I would just say, Amanda, I just think that there are people who lack imagination and who are so afraid of violating norms, and they'll sit up here and watch other people violate norms all the time and say they can't do that, etc. And those people need to be pushed. Yeah. Those people need a little nudge to help them in terms of, doing the right thing. And I just think you all play such an important role in terms of a strong voice, in terms of protecting voting rights and keeping folks focused on kind of the right thing and being strong and not saying, well, what will Mitch McConnell think or what will Sean Hannity think? We can't do that kind of thing. So that imagination, the movement building, it's incredibly important. We need you.
Yeah, 100%. I don't know if folks on here are watching Lovecraft Country right now, but I one of the reasons I call myself Afrofuturist is because I really imagine this world where there's this marriage of the beautiful, rich history of our people connected with the power of technology, and I think about how if I speak those things as they should be, what does that world look like for me? So I so appreciate kind of the framing of an affirmative vision. And to you, Marissa, I just want to turn to you. Listen, we know Black Lives Matter, We know Black disabled lives matter. We know Black trans lives matter. We know that young Black lives matter. We know that Black women's lives matter, right? But we don't always target those communities to engage in our political process. You know, I think about my fellow Black disabled brothers and sisters and the fear of showing up to the polls, what that looks like. And how are you targeting your messages for the kind of variance in our community, Black immigrants who disproportionately are showing up with high rates of voter turnout? But we know that, listen, we've had a year where ICE has been in our Black communities so frequently that you have this fear in so many of our Black immigrant communities. So how are you targeting some of the different segments of our Black experience?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. One of the things that we're doing with our work, and we've been very consistent with this, and other groups do this especially well, Color Change and others, is recognizing like this is not a monolith. Not all Black people are the same. Not all Black people have the same, need the same messenger, or the same messages are going to be resonant in terms of why they actually make voting a priority, or what they're voting for, or the things that are really, that are going to galvanize them to take an action, right? So our work, one, is to make change behavior, right? Focus on making voting habitual, and again, making it easy. So if you're feeling intimidated, I mean, we have like militias running around our country right now. So if you don't want to go to a polling place, we want to make it easy. We want you to vote by mail. We want you to be informed. Oftentimes when we think about, you know, sort of how we cut through a universe of Black voters, a lot of times these are low information voters. A lot of people's lives are stretched. They don't have time. They don't know exactly what's on the ballot. So giving them information early, giving them education, allowing them to vote by mail by making it easy for them so they can sit with their ballot and make choices that make the most sense for them, for their communities, for their lives is a big piece of the work we're doing. We also recognize like our lane may not be this messaging and talking directly to what's happening in their lives. Our lane is really getting people registered, making sure that they are informed about what's going on, the election that's happening and what's on the ballot and what's at stake, and making it easy. But we also want to make sure we're working in a coalition with the groups who are the proper messengers and who can disseminate the proper message to these different segments of our population. Like that's where we understand, like we know our lane, we know other people's lane, but really it's working in concert to make sure we're doing everything early and often so that people have the tools that they need and are really hearing the messages that matter most to them.
Now, if you are following along, I'm going to ask you to do one thing. Everybody take out your phones, and I want you to follow Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. I want you to follow Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, the only Black think tank that we have. We need to up that. Follow Spencer, follow Amanda, follow Marissa, follow Michelle, because you will see our accounts and the work that we do over the next 12 days continue to push out an affirmative vision of the world that we are imagining and the work that we want to do. So please make sure you do that while you're joining us. Follow at ELC Info, one of the partners today. If you are listening, there are targeted states that Lyft, the company, the ride sharing company, are doing discounts on rides to the polls. If you go to Lyft/vote, you can find out information on how to get a discounted ride to the polls and key voting locations around the country. And so many thanks to all of the companies, the industries, the organizations who are really stepping up. Now, each of you do yeoman's work every single day. I am thankful because a lot of the reason why I do what I do, my great aunt Lois, my family on my come from the island. So Bermuda and Jamaica, and on the small island of Bermuda, my great aunt, grandmother were really part of the vanguard of the civil rights movement there. She was later knighted by Queen Elizabeth and was first Black woman lawyer. And so I stand on her shoulders. I remember agonizing about whether or not I went to law school or seminary, and talking to my auntie and really saying, let your work be your ministry, right? Let you live out what you are supposed to do in whatever way that you feel at this moment. Each of you stand on someone else's shoulders. We think about the toil and work of our ancestors and all that they've done. And so I'd like each of you to just kind of give your ancestor story, right? Because I think one thing that is so important for us as a people to understand is that what we're seeing is the current iteration, but we've gone through so much worse, right? I think sometimes we're like, this is the worst time in history. I'm like, no, when they kidnap your child and threaten you with rape and we're raping you every day, that's a different kind of story, right? But those lessons help to move us to where we are. We are our dreams. We are the living manifestation of our ancestors' hopes. So I would love to hear each of you, and see, this is me preaching a little bit. K-Fane, AME, they're coming through, Spencer. I would love to hear each of your ancestors' story and what you hold on to while you're doing this work. So I'm going to start with you, Amanda.
Yeah. What I hold on to is voting with my grandmother. So my grandmother is 79 or 80, around there. But she is very passionate about voting, right? Like nothing's going to get in her way. And so it's sort of become a ritual for she and I to spend election day together. And that has been the case since I was old enough to vote. And what has evolved from that is not only will I take her to vote in her precinct, her neighbors will come with me. You know, sometimes I'll make more than one trip and carry them to the polls and take them back. But it is an experience that I very much so treasure and look forward to. And I should mention, I am a South Carolinian. My family is from South Carolina. Yeah, those are the roots. And so like, even within that, as an organizer in South Carolina, you know, I faced all kinds of threats working with Black farmers and working with immigrants, Black immigrants in the state. And so like sharing those stories in doses to my family, like that was always the motivating factor, because we knew that, you know, we had not reached this point to where we had, quote, arrived or have, you know, could maybe move past sort of the tension or in the South of what it would mean to vote, particularly if it comes from a place of passion and rooted in issues. And so that has just always been the driving force. It's something we share, we do. I'm currently in Maryland in my home in Baltimore, but I'll go back South and we will vote again this year. Together, I'll carry whomever else needs to go. And yeah, we'll move forward from there and just, you know, keep doing it for as long as we're fortunate enough to be able to do so.
Please give grandma a hug from me when you go and see her. I'm not having my grandma, so please do that for me. Marissa.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a political family. My dad was an organizer and worked in campaigns. So there was no neutrality in that house. Like, you had to do the work. We were on campaigns since we were very little kids. But I think about like our evolution as a family and how he arrived at that place. You know, my great grandfather was a slave. So like, you talk about progress and generational progress and like whose shoulders you really stand on and what your responsibility is. And I think about that, like, that's what drives me into this work and makes it, you know, that's what makes it worth doing. But we grew up with like, people are the power, and like, that is real. And I think this election, especially 2020, given everything that's going on, it will be a true reflection of that.
All right, Spencer, you're up. Now,
Sure.
your ancestry were just a Google Doodle, so you're gonna have to break it down for us all the way down. Go ahead.
Well, I want to follow Marissa's lead and really acknowledge first three of my great grandparents who were born as enslaved persons, right? Kind of respecting them and the sacrifices that they made. You know, three of my mother's four grandparents here. So there are some folks who've been inspiring some other folks. William Hamilton was in New York. He was a founder of the AME Church. There were about 13 people, AME Zion Church, and Mother Bethel up there. He was also very active in the emancipation of Black people in New York. So there was a time in the early 1800s where there were folks who were really holding to the fire, John Jay and Hamilton and others, in terms of the emancipation of Black people in New York State. And he was one of them, and also very hostile to Jefferson and other folks. It's interesting. His children were publishers who helped recruit Black folks to fight in the Civil War. On another side, there was a guy named A.D. Shadd who's inspirational to me. In the early 1800s, he was big in terms of the Underground Railroad, lived in Delaware. When they prevented Black folks from learning, he moved his family to Pennsylvania. And then the Fugitive Slave Act came along, and they actually had to leave the country and go to Canada, North Buxton, Ontario, and which was a former slave settlement there. And two of his children, one is Marianne Shadd, Carrie, who you mentioned, who's a publisher and was a major abolitionist. She's the first Black woman lawyer in the country, first Black woman to enroll at Howard Law School, and the first Black woman to vote in the United States, reportedly. Her brother was someone named I.D. Shadd, and he was actually the first Black speaker in Mississippi during Reconstruction. So now that didn't last very long in terms of I.D. Shadd, but you know, they've made some real significant contributions, and you know, I'm obviously inspired by them, and anything I do pales compared to the challenges that they faced, right? And so those are some of the people who inspire me.
I love that, and I thank you all for kind of sharing that. You know, as I think about my mother's side, who came up through the deep South in Florida, and kind of her tracing her origins and her background to a plantation that we were able to visit when I was very young. And then this Black immigrant experience. I mean, everyone on this panel, we are the embodiment of the American story. And so I just really thank you for that, because I think tying the connection of the work that we do to our foremothers and fathers, I think is so important as we think about and we vision our future. So we are gonna get ready to go to some question and answer. And I know I've seen some great things happening in the chat, but before we go, I would just like each of you, you know, I am a lawyer, and so in some ways I believe in institutions, right? And so I've worked in many institutions, but I've also spent part of my life as an activist and an advocate on the outside. I'd love each of you just to give me kind of what is the one institution that you would, if I gave you your magic wand, what is the one institution that you would change tomorrow? What is that Congress? Is that the Supreme Court? Is that state legislatures? Give me something. And then I want you to imagine. So we are 10 years from now. What are we looking at? What are we talking about? What have we fixed and where we're going? So give me the institution and give me the future. So I'm going to start with you, Marissa, because you were smiling at me the most on that one.
At this point, it would be the courts. That's what I would change as of right now. I think looking 10 years ahead, I mean, and Amanda brought this up, I don't want to be fighting the same battles of not having a representative census where we have, you know, all of our lines need to be redrawn, and we're essentially disenfranchising gigantic swaths of this population. I want our electorate to be representative. I want our institutions to be representative. I want our representatives to actually represent the people in their community. That's what I really want. I want a participatory democracy that is reflective of like the values of this country and of its citizenry. I think that's the most important thing that we can hope for, and to make voting easy.
I love that. Amanda?
Yeah, echo courts, and you know, just forgetting Congress altogether, right? Like all that should govern this. Just thinking about the court's role in supporting agencies, right? Like I'm thinking about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, some of the things coming out of different federal agencies. So I really would wave a wand at the courts to do so much better by them. Because they really do impact us in ways we just don't immediately see. And then 10 years out, yeah, like I wanna actually say this is a democracy and believe it, right? Like I want that to be the truth 10 years from this very moment. Because I will be honest with you in stating that I personally struggle with that sentence. And so I wholeheartedly believe, you know, with the help of all of you out there tuning in, you know, fellow colleagues here on this panel, Sabrina and folks who, you know, couldn't be here, but are very much so felt that we will carve out the space for that to just be the ultimate truth.
All right, Spencer.
I think I'm a little older, so I think I may not be as ambitious as Marissa and Amanda. And what I want is really strong Black institutions. I think that other institutions around us are going to go up and down. I think they're going to, but I think if we have strong Black institutions that are supporting Black people, no matter what happens around us in terms of leaders, you know, they come and go. I think that laws change, et cetera. But if we've got strong organizations that do different things, you know, not just a think tank, that's important, but, you know, movement organizations, you know, other just variety of healthy civic, you know, civil society, Black organizations, to me, that are well run and that are growing and well funded. I think that that is critical, because I think it's almost like a flood may be coming. And we just want an ark, right, that is going to basically protect our folks to make it through the ups and the downs of whatever may happen in terms of this country. And so for me, 10 years from now, and I definitely agree with Marissa and Amanda about courts and other importance, but the thing to me that we can control, some of that stuff we can't always control. We can't control what we do. And so these strong Black institutions, to me, is imperative.
I love that. I love that. Each of those answers so powerful. So I hope that we are all hearing that and taking lessons. And again, follow the great work of the folks on this panel and the foundation as we really think about how we can make that our reality. So I'm going to go to some of the questions that are coming in the chat, and I'm going to this first one anyone can take, but you know, this is something that both you, Amanda, and Spencer spoke about earlier, that if we know that there was Russian misinformation that was really targeted at the Black community, why wasn't there some accountability? And I think in the question referred to particularly Donald Trump, but I think it's a broader question around kind of accountability, like who is responsible for protecting our communities from that information. And I'll just quickly answer a piece of it. You know, listen, I'm very much engaged at a social media company and making sure that we are doing what needs to be done to take down kind of content that adds to this kind of confusion. Even Spencer and I were engaged in a conversation last week about the role of kind of social media platforms and the responsibility that they have. So I think that that's not just a one person is responsible for that. But I'd love your input, Spencer and Amanda.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll quickly say, right, like we clearly need federal regulation, but that's not going to happen, at least not before November 3rd. We'll see what happens after that and maybe into the new year, provided there's a new administration. But the foremost, I think, immediate responsibility are tech companies. And so we very much so believe at Color of Change holding platforms accountable, asking Twitter directly to take down the misinformation or voter manipulation. Same with Facebook and just any other tech platform that has that reach and that allows for that stuff to sit on their sites. And that's what we have been doing. We've gotten a lot of accounts suspended and gotten posts taken down. And as a result, of course, we are often targeted by a lot of the white nationalists and those who spew misinformation because, well, they rely on those platforms for vehicles for that kind of stuff. So for us right now, our immediate angle is targeting tech platforms and corporations.
Let me just say, tech companies have an incredibly important role to play. I agree with Amanda. Something that's happening in this country right now is that there is bullying of tech companies by the federal government so that they don't take down disinformation that suppresses Black votes. And we need a couple things. One, we need tech companies to have a spine and to stand up and to take down disinformation and not cower there. we also need listeners and folks, when you see disinformation, to report it and to hold these tech companies accountable and responsible. Color of Change and the NAACP have done a magnificent job in terms of really holding companies accountable and responsible, and recognizing that these companies often make money on clicks and eyeballs and advertising. And there's some stuff that they don't advertise against. Adult pornography is one of them. And that they should treat racism in the same way, that they're not going to advertise against it, they're not going to sell against it. And Color Change has been stellar in that. And so holding the tech companies accountable, I think, is incredibly important. Let me just say one other quick note here, Michelle, and I see something about young folks, and I don't mean to jump too far ahead. I think that, and this goes to where we need to be 10 years from now, younger folks have created the political environment we are in now, the political environment where companies are trying to be responsive in terms of being more inclusive of Black folks, et cetera. And there's just so much like energy and intolerance of just, this is the way it is, and let's get along, and I'm used to being treated like a second-class citizen, and this is what reality is, right? And so I think we need to like appreciate that, value that in terms of moving us along, and figure out how to elevate those folks so that in 10 years, they're really leading well-funded organizations and really moving us forward. So I think they've got all the right stuff in terms of commitment and vision. And then the question is, are we going to do what we can to ensure that they have the resources and the support and everything that they need to lead, well-funded, well-functioning institutions 10 years from now.
I love that. I love that. And Marissa, I'm going to give you this next one. Can you share a little bit about some of the proactive things that you've been doing and working with boards of elections to really do the preparation? We know voter suppression sometimes looks like lack of resources in our communities, right? And so can you talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing on the preventative side?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at some of the primaries that we saw earlier this year, it's part incompetence, it's part, lack of resources, and then there's some actual voter suppression, and like it's a perfect storm that sort of has happened, especially mixed with COVID. We talked about this earlier, the change in not having canvas-based operations for voter registration and for, really having conversations with voters changed the landscape. And this has been one of the most dynamic landscapes. And as a result, you see a lot more people requesting absentee ballots and wanting to vote by mail or returning their voter registration via mail when they would have done it at the DMV or done it in person. So elections officials have been inundated and overwhelmed. They don't have the bandwidth, they don't have internal infrastructure, they don't have even the means to process oftentimes use, the vote by mail recruitment and ship ballots out. They don't know anything about postage. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is actually just educating them about best practices. Like, in Michigan, everything changed, right? The entire slate of laws changed in terms of early in person, vote by mail expansion. And none of the, clerks had the resources to actually, implement these things or hire teams. So we let them know, one, that we're running programs in their state. We let them know who the programs are going to be targeting, when the registration applications are going to be returned, the same for vote by mail, and then also really aid them with best practices in this space so that they know, and they know how to ask for what they aren't getting currently from the secretaries of state or the governors in their state as well. That's been a big part of our work this year.
Now, this is something that I think many of us have participated at some point, but the nonpartisan work of the Election Protection Hotline, one of the questions that has come in through the chat is, listen, I'm going to do my bit in helping people get out to vote, but I also want to be proactive in protecting the vote. I want to, share information about voter intimidation. So can someone, I will tell you, our good friend, Kristen Clark Avery at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights has been leading the Election Protection Coalition. And that is a toll-free number, 1-866-OUR-VOTE. You can go to 866-OUR-VOTE. There you go. Spencer put it in the hotline. It is a nonpartisan, huge effort from a number of organizations on election protection. And that hotline is live now. So you can use Twitter, Facebook, call, text, if you're encountering problems. And then they work with local boards of elections. They work with local organizations to both help and remedy. The other thing that I'll say is if you search on Google for like where do I go and vote, the first thing that comes up, don't look at anything on the bottom, is a little box at the top that's called our authoritative one box. It has the contact information for your local boards of election. We're doing geo-targeting so that you can see where's my polling place or where's the early vote center. And if we don't have that information, then we're going to refer you to the boards of elections. So I will tell you, I've seen more of an engagement this year on giving voters information. And I don't know if Spencer or Amanda, you want to talk to some of those efforts as well.
Yeah, us too, just echoing the Lawyers Committee's election protection hotline is definitely a huge source for us of voter engagement, as well as just content generation and just generating, putting together a plan for folks and pushing that out through our lists. And then also just kind of leaning into, again, just calling on those actors who are in the position to do so, to take down things that would deter our folks from voting. So those are really, I think, the three efforts I would name more immediately.
And y'all might see me mothering on the side with all of my little people. Somebody just popped on screen a little while. This is COVID life. You get it all. You get it all, right? So one of the things that just popped in from Brother William Turner, he shared, what do regular citizens do to try to prevent us from voting based on kind of the assumption that you'll support a preferred candidate. And I think what he's trying to, or what he's asking is, how do we make sure that we're doing outreach to everyone? And I think that this is one of the points that you made, Marissa, like, how do you get the zero propensity voter? Can any of you kind of speak to some of your efforts to engage everyone?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just having a conversation. I think a lot of the people have decided early on that they're not going to vote. So they're not worth the resources, they're not worth the time, they're not worth the effort. But I think engaging in a conversation and meeting somebody where they are is a big piece of it, one. And then like two, I think it's really a comprehensive effort. Like there's part of it that has to happen in person or on the phones. There's a piece of that that's digital. But I think it's all really relational and like just meeting somebody where they are and arming them and giving them the tools and the education so that they can make an informed decision. If they choose not to vote, but at least you're there and you're having a conversation on the front end. I think that's a big piece, or like the first step towards it.
Another issue there that I might read into that is, what do we do when somebody assumes we're going to vote a particular way because we're Black and tries to challenge us at the polls here, right? Or tries to do something to obstruct our participation, right? And, you all know this better than I do, just in terms of really not getting discouraged, staying in there, being professional, not escalating. I mean, you've seen so many of these situations escalate where they blame it on, the BLM people as opposed to somebody else. And so just, I think, being calm and collected and ensuring that you participate is key, and appreciating that may come. And folks who've come before us have dealt with tough stuff, and we're gonna have to deal with some stuff too,
One of the other, and we are close to the middle of the hour. So if you have any other questions for the panelists, I encourage you to put it in. We're going to do maybe one or two, and then we're going to do closing remarks. So if you have any questions, because these folks got to get back to work. We got work to do. We got 12 days. So if you have any questions or concerns, just pop it into the chat for us. Someone mentioned poll workers, and I realize we've we've been talking and we haven't necessarily mentioned poll workers. Are any of you familiar with any efforts around recruiting of poll workers? I know Brother LeBron James did a huge recruitment effort, 10,000 young people, some of whom aren't even voting age, put forth a huge poll worker effort. So can anybody speak to that?
I will say Shorthand Color Change is working with different precincts and trying to make sure poll workers have proper PPE, and that there are also accessibility needs met, and working with our disabled communities and in making sure folks are being met and met in that way. But for the most part, it's sort of for us kind of the same, right? Like making sure folks feel equipped, that there's a plan, and you know, with whenever we're in touch with poll workers, just asking the question, what do you need? And hopefully we're in a position to respond.
So from as a part of the younger Black generation coming into leadership, how can we instill the importance of voting and civic engagement in our peers? And I actually want to add a bit to this, because I want to add a bit and I want to expand on something, and then we'll take one more thing. You know, right now there are a bunch of memes and actually a little bit of division on Twitter and some of the social media platforms about the engagement between Black women and Black men. And I think it's a really toxic narrative, right? Like we know Black women are the most consistent turnout voters. However, there seems to be sometimes this pitting of Black women versus Black men. I'd like to kind of dispense with that, but I'd love to hear how you are helping to kind of break through that, really engaging young people, but really how we deal with that fissure that we see pops up. And I think some of this came because we saw a higher percentage of Black men supported a different candidate in 2016. And I think that might have been some of the origins, but can you talk to that? I think that there's so many things generationally. I've had hours of conversations with some of my sisters and brothers about this fissure, or what I like to say is a perceived fissure between us. And I frankly know that some of this is based on that William and Calvin Russian disinformation, right? So talk a little bit about that and how you're working to engage everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think two things, right? Like, I think there's the piece on younger voter engagement, or like the generational aspect, and then there's the aspect that falls along gender lines. I think even the piece around Black women, or the quote unquote disparities of Black women and men voter engagement is disinformation, right? And we've just fallen into that. We've allowed that to create this cultural gap that, you know, doesn't really exist. The truth of the matter is, while there are and always have been Black people who vote opposite of, I think, typically what the higher concentration votes, it has not been on par with, you know, the dominant percentage there. So in other words, right, like more Black people tend to vote Democratic than Republican, and we're in the 80 to 90 percentile of what that means. There have not been equally similar numbers of folks voting for the GOP. And so like this narrative that there's this swath of Black men or a swath of Black voters voting for the GOP, and you know, then allowing that swath to just fall along gender lines is just inaccurate. And so like that's another example of like mis and disinformation targeting our communities. And so for me, it's a question of the source. I do think that there is something to be said around like what propels folks to vote, right? Black women, we tend to vote for our families. In different ways than Black men, right? So like understanding if we wanted to have a conversation about that, like the structure, family units and so on more microly, that is a space to engage. But the larger narrative is one that I think we have to push back on and call out on its face. And then secondly, the piece going to the question in the chat around like the generational aspect, I appreciate it. I also want to name that too many times, right? Like the onus of younger folks voting is always put on them as if they're just actively disengaged, right? Like we created this system where disengagement is the end result. So how do we chip away at that, right? Like how are we making sure that folks resonate where people are, right? Like meeting people where they are, like Marissa said, making sure that they're candidates that in fact do that and the system meets them there as well. So like the onus isn't just a sole, I think, burden for young folks to carry or folks of a different generation to carry. It's on those of other generations to ask those questions as well.
I just wanted to chime in terms of saying, some of these differences are exaggerated. They're exaggerated. To the extent that there are some differences, we probably do need some Black women to play a leadership role here for us in terms of getting us to get out to the polls. And very frankly, this isn't everybody. There is some kind of toxic masculinity in terms of ways to show power, whether it's being promiscuous or having your pit bull or whatever it is. And there, some candidates embody that more than others here, right? Where you're like covering for some other things through this kind of hyper masculinity. In terms of the younger people point, my sense from talking to some younger folks is that people aren't into like BS or fakeness or like putting on a show. So they like want something that's real. They don't want to like be manipulated or taken advantage of here. And so I think there's this real question about how do we convert protest into policy? How are we seriously engaged even after an election, that we're not pawns, right? We're not like, okay, we got enough money to win. We got enough Black voters to win. Like these are just resources to acquire power, as opposed to us really participating in terms of power. How do we engage in a meaningful way after an election as Black folks in terms of policy?
Marissa, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think Spencer brought this up earlier. The place that we are politically in terms of the shifts and really forcing accountability of our leaders is happening because of this younger generation. So yeah, we've created these systems that make it really, really hard for them to participate, and we put the onus on them, as Amanda said. But the reality is these shifts are happening because they want real representation, they want real change. And how you create that systemically and long-term is exactly what Spencer said. It's what happens after election day. It's great to get people to turn out, but like if you're not speaking to them and again in their communities, talking to them about where that vote leads and how that changes things in their lives, I don't think you gain long-term power, and you don't change anything in terms of what's happening systemically in this country. I think to the other piece, in terms of fissures between Black men and Black women, I'm more concerned that turnout was down in 16, right? Versus like the defection to the third party. There are some issues in terms of maybe it is toxic masculinity, or there's a divergent path in terms of, preference in terms of candidates, but the progressivity is still there. I'm just more concerned, like making sure that we're actually turning out at our demographic strength versus, I just want you to turn out. If you vote third party, that's your prerogative, but like you need to actually vote. And I think that was the biggest concern coming out of 16. And I think that's something we need to rectify now.
Well, we are almost at close, and I know that there are still a few questions in the chat. I'll say this, 866 our vote. If there's someone referred to a landlord sending intimidated, you can both report that to 866 our vote. You can also report that to the Board of Elections, screenshot it, take a picture. That type of intimidation is not allowed, and it's illegal. Right. And so by all means, please take pictures of it, document it, and share it with the Nonpartisan Election Protection Coalition. Call up the Board of Elections. There are a number of resources that were included in the chat today. Make sure that you're following the folks that were part of this, and you can always, hey, on social, hey, I saw this, what do I do? And all of the great kind of knowledge and background and relationships of the people on the panel can chime in. So we are getting ready to close, and I always have to leave on a positive, right? So my dad's a lawyer and my mom's an AME pastor. So, you know, we're going to go to the mountaintop before we close out today. I am truly inspired by the work that each of you do, the way that we have chosen to live our life is a choice. Not everyone makes this choice to be focused on this work, right? There are other paths, but you chose this work, and so I am forever grateful and inspired by you. What do you say today to our panelists? How do they hold on hope? There's 12 days. There's a lot happening. We're still in the midst of COVID. A lot of our folks, 40 million unemployed, disproportionately high amount of those are women and people of color. Let's end with some hope. What are each of you doing to hold on to hope for the rest of the year, for the next 12 days? But tell us your strategy for hope right now. So I'm going to start with Marissa, because I like putting Marissa on the spot first.
Right now, hope looks like absentee and early vote data, watching it come in and seeing participation, especially among Black voters. That makes me feel good. That gives me hope that we're going to win in 12 days, and that will guide me into 2021.
All right. Amanda.
Yeah, hope is like us having a call with a tech company or some corporation and us pretty much stating what we want and them agreeing, or we go public on them and then they come to agree, and like, you know, wielding, you know, our influence in that way for the greater good of Black people. It's such a warm feeling. And so I just lean into that to know that, you know, I'm not alone in this moment, and I'm carrying that with me.
Love that. Spencer?
Yeah, hope is seeing millions of young Black people really transform our country in the past year. They've been working on it for years, but we saw them being joined by people of all racial backgrounds, of all ages this year. So that's encouraging. That gives me great hope. And then the other thing I think that gives me hope is that we're all called on to just do what we can do. None of us can do it all. None of us can do everything. We can't focus on just the outcome and are we going to win this or win that here. We're called on to make our contribution, and that's it. So us focusing on what's inside of our control in terms of our profession and our circle of life, in terms of, you know, mobilizing folks in terms of a movement, or protecting votes and mobilizing voters in terms of Marissa, or whether it is being a think tank, or whether it is making a plan to vote and getting out to vote and getting your family out to vote. We're all called to do our thing. And to me, that gives me hope.
And I will just say that my hope came from the fact that 167 of you, I think as the high point, participated in a conversation about voting rights on a Thursday afternoon. That means something. That means that you now have an hour and a half more information, knowledge, wisdom, resources, and inspiration to pull through. And so I find my hope in you. I find my hope in my community, in the beauty of my community, the diversity of our lived experiences, and really recognizing that our ancestors spent 12 generations in bondage. 12 generations, never saw freedom. And we are here today really talking about not only how we take things to the next level, but how we imagine a world where we are even more free and even more proud, and have made great gains. And that gives me hope. I love being a part of that story. So I thank you, my sister Amanda, Marissa, my brother Spencer. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Thank you to ELC and Union Pacific and Lyft and Google and everybody who participated today. Color of Change, the Voter Participation Project, and the Joint Center for all of the great work you do. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Naomi.
Thank you so much, Ms. Michelle. This was like a dynamic panel. I'm definitely more hopeful for future generations after me, and just the resources, the history, like the personal journey shared were truly great. So thank you so much for all of your participation. And again, thank you to the Executive Leadership Council, Union Pacific Railroads, and Lyft for their sponsorship of this session. And I'd just like to invite everyone to our next Policy for the People session on October 29th at the same time, 3 o'clock to 4:30 p.m., where we have a host of experts in Black women and Black women leadership. So this is going to be another great panel, and we really encourage you all to join. And if you have any questions or want more information on what the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation is doing right now, I encourage you to check out our website at www.cbcfinc.org. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.